Time being 11:32 a.m. on January 19th, 2022. I'd like to call this meeting to order of Kane County's American Rescue Plan Committee. Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Bates,
Here.
Brown,
Brown here.
Froz,
Froz here.
Gums, Kenyon,
Here.
Leonard,
Leonard here.
Martin,
Martin present.
Molina,
Molina present.
Strothman,
Strathman here.
and Tepe.
Tepe here.
Oh, and Sanchez. Can't forget.
I think I'm here. I think I'm here.
Sorry.
It's all good. All right, we have a quorum. If someone could please ask for unanimous consent to approve the minutes of December 22nd, 2021.
So move.
I
Tepe move.
saw Kenyon's hand go up, so I'm going to give it to him.
Doesn't make any difference.
Doesn't make a difference.
Be first or second, I don't care.
Is there any objection to these minutes? Hearing and seeing none, they are approved. Public comments on agenda and non-agenda items. Do we have anyone here for public comment?
Gloria.
If you could please approach the podium, you might need to bring the microphone down to face level. It's there for a giant, apparently. And just state your name, and you have 3 minutes.
Okay. Oh, 3 minutes. Perfect. Hi, my name is Gloria Kelly. I'm the Executive Director of Casa King County. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I just wanted to touch base on a few things. And one, I think it's important. I think you all know what we do in serving abused, neglected children in our community. Our approach has been a child-to-child, case-to-case, and a casa-to-casa volunteer that really modifies the specialized needs on execution to make it happen. And working directly with children and families in and out of the courtroom, we have always ensured they are treated with respect, patience, dignity, while working together in a triage approach to problem solve for the best interest of all children. And knowing that there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of things I want to share. But let me share one thing first and foremost, and this is actually from a judge's perspective, because as a court-appointed party to the case and a GAL, independence is what judges find most crucial about the CASA volunteer's role. The child's voice demands an advocate who fulfills the role and also speaks clearly with determination about what is in the best for that child, even in that position when it stands alone. Judges listen carefully to each word written and spoken by a CASA. The judge depends on them to gather all the information to facilitate, communicate among all the collaborative team members. I always refer to them as the nucleus of our county. To master skills of advocacy and to have commitment to monitoring the case progresses to permanency. For the judge to make a sound decision, it requires much more. While maintaining positive relationships with all individuals surrounding the child, the CASA volunteer is obliged to be self-determined and never swayed or influenced by others. Upon taking that oath to serve, a volunteer commits to act as principal participant in those legal proceedings. This means offering a position on behalf of the child based on unbiased information and free from outside pressure or personal interest. So let me give you one example of many. A few months ago, we had an unfortunate situation, and with COVID, we're not able to see every single child in person because of health concerns in the CDC and what DCFS is going through. But we will do, we also do virtuals, we do visits, drive-bys, we'll stop in schools. And so right now we're about 80% of in-person visits. So 3 months ago, there was a real concern with 2 of the children we found out were not going to school. So the CASA was diligent, unfortunately, the grandmother who was their family guardian said, you know what, we're good. You can't see him. We have a court order that says we can. So we went in, sure enough, she took a walk with the kids, and one, she found out they were not attending any schools. Number 2, she noticed fingerprints all around the 2 children's necks. And so when she saw that and very alarmed, the kids were shaken to the core because, paternal grandmother said, if you say one thing to anyone, I will make sure that you never see each other again, and threaten to kill them. So these are 7 and a 9-year-old. Could you imagine them being your own kids or your own grandchildren? It makes me sick. And these are the things we have to deal with every day. So sure enough, they came back. Our CASA volunteer talked to our supervisor and attorney, made the hotline call. These children were immediately taken out of that home and placed into another protective care with a guardian, and our our visits are increased tremendously. That is just one of many, many. And I will share these just few little short scenarios of a continuous about why we are making a difference. A 10-year-old male runaway, guardian is now disabled and cannot care for the minor, has exhibited sexualized behavior, has previously threatened to kill himself or others, and claims her voice is telling him to do bad things. Parents and grandparents are bipolar. 9-year-old found with a police officer out of a warrant call was told by someone that they sounded like a child had been beaten. The officer knocked on the door. Dad denied any child was home. Finally admitted to his son was hiding under the blankets. He had welts in various places all over his body. Child said he got whooped for eating leftover Chinese food, not finding his debit card. Father was charged with aggravated battery, child abuse, and is now in jail. The mental health issues that we are all dealing with, and we're CASA, because we are all of King County, our partnerships and collaboration with our judiciary, with our mental health facilities, with other social workers, working collaboratively with our agencies. And this year alone, we had 570 kids that we served in just abuse and neglect. CASA since 2003 also does private guardianship cases and probate, and we had to put that on hold. But second quarter, we're going to come back because we just hired 5 new advocate supervisors. We have a case-to-case supervisor ratio to cover children because we need that time. And the resources right now, we're struggling like everyone else, but yet we're court appointed. So our obligation is, we're always jumping hoops for our judiciary, and they know that. And when you hear time and time again that it's our reports that the judge reads first and foremost, that's something that our program can be very proud of, and I hope you are as well. So just wanted to share a little bit about what we're doing and the impact that our program's having tremendously in kids in foster care.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Appreciate your comments.
I thank you, and thanks for all you do.
Is there anyone else who would like to deliver a public comment on agenda or non-agenda items? I don't see anyone in person, but is there any online? Are there any online? Okay, we'll move on. Chairman's comments. I don't have any for today. So we have our first discussion items. Program manager update, Mr. Phillips. Is he online? I don't know if he made it online. No, he has some family things going on right now to attend to. But there wasn't much of an update from the program manager for this month. I do know that. There's a lot of things going on. You guys are receiving the weekly updates, so you get a little sense of what's going on behind the scenes as we work with our consultant for this program. Okay, up next, do we have Gary Burke on the line? Mr. Burke with Ernst & Young, he's going to walk us through the financial worksheet, the funding summary that they have put together in coordination with our finance department. So Mr. Burke, I will let you take over. I think you can share your screen if you'd like.
So now I'm on. Hopefully the screen sharing's work. You should be able to see a spreadsheet on the screen.
Yep, we can see it.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Sanchez. So wanted to walk the committee through a high level reconciliation of the available fiscal recovery funds from the U.S. Treasury that have been allocated to King County, and then a view as to what's been resolved, what's been budgeted of sorts, and then ultimately coming down to what's remaining at a summary. And then we'll walk through a detailed schedule on how the finance director, Mr. Onzik, has estimated the use of some of those funds. But for the committee's benefit, the total allocation for U.S. Treasury, as you all know, is roughly $103 million. Half of that has been received so far. Half will be received in a few months. Of that 103, roughly $19.5 million has been resolved. 7.4 related to lost revenue, roughly 2 million for the mass vaccination site, 4 million for contact tracing, the community support grants, a $4 million resolution, COVID expenses that have been incurred previously, roughly $500,000, and then an estimate of 1.4 million for ARPA administration. In addition to the 19.5 that's been resolved, we're estimating another 17.2 million that we're taking out of the quote unquote available funds for use. We're taking out roughly $16 million related to the fiscal 22 lost revenue calculation. That's going to be used to help shore up the fiscal 22 county budget. We've also made an estimate for ARP administration. The 1.4 in the resolve section includes some of the administration for 3 years, others at 1 year. So in the $1,025,000 in the estimate, we've taken all of the administration out for the full 3 years. So the total resolved plus the budgeted to be resolved is roughly $36.7 million. That leaves, again, roughly $66.7 million that is remaining to be resolved and allocated. The summary below just refers to the timing of the cash. As I mentioned, half of the 103 million has been received to date. Based on the above, 36 million has been spoken for or used, leaving roughly 15 million of cash that would be available to be spent. When the other allocation, half the allocation comes in later this year, that will add another 52 million, bringing the roughly 67 million again to be spent. I'll move to another slightly more detailed summary. What this attempts to do is it relies on information provided by Mr. Onsick as for what are the current revenue recoupment estimates for all the available fiscal years, so fiscal 20 through fiscal 23. It also includes an estimate of the public safety, both the sheriff and the health department, that would be eligible per the Treasury guidance as a use of the ARPA funds. And those individuals have to be addressing COVID directly. So it's an estimate of what's happening in fiscal 21, but also what we expect to happen through fiscal 24, given the uncertainty of the pandemic. So you see the revenue recoupment as well as the payroll reimbursements are estimates at this point in time that will be trued up over the upcoming fiscal years, should the committee want to use those for your ARPA funding. Number 3, the mass vaccination. This is, again, just what's been currently resolved for the mass vaccination site. And the below items, again, the contract tracing, community support grants, COVID expenditures, and ARPA administration, which includes all 3 years for all the administrations. So under this summary, again, using the estimates for the potential maximum allotment for lost revenues over all the fiscal years, there's roughly $6.8 million that's not been allocated or earmarked for a potential use. So that's all column B. The columns going to the right describes in a little more detail what's been resolved, what's been included in the budget, and what's an estimate. And the final column that you see on the far right is what's been reported to Treasury. So recall that there was an August 31st report to Treasury. There's another report that's due at the end of this month that will require less information, but still a quantification of what's been obligated and what's been used by the county to date. Mr. Sanchez, is there other things you'd like me to cover?
Well, we're going to talk about the revenue recoupment formula and the change in the final rule in a moment. But if you could just show the chart, the final rule now says that we can, in the formula, we can assume up to 5.2% of revenue growth. And this is what it would look like. So I just wanted to make sure you covered that.
Yeah, thanks. So let me flip back really quick. So using the final rule of the 5.2 maximum, the total revenue recoupment, again, estimated for the fiscal years would increase to 84.2 million effectively. That's a difference of between the 62, 63 million under the 4.1. So again, those are maximums that the county could choose to take. They could take 0 or they could take up to that maximum.
Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burke, I've got a question for you with respect to the maximum projected. Are you using the 4.1% revenue? And in fact, don't we have the ability, if we want to increase that to approximately 5.2%?
Yes, that's correct. And so there's the screen that's currently showed it would be the estimate provided by Mr. Onsick if the county chose to go to 5.2. And then the other file here is if the county chose to remain at the current estimates of 4.1. So Mr. Onzig has provided information on both using the 4.1 estimate and the 5.2 estimate.
Sir, could you please point to some of these numbers as you're speaking?
Yeah, absolutely.
Pointer's right there. Thank you.
So under 5.2, Mr. Onzig's numbers using 5.2 growth, there would be $84 million of potential revenue recoupment for the 4 fiscal years. That's opposed to going back to the 4.1 analysis, when he used 4.1%, the resulting math came out to $63 million, which is here.
All right, thank you, Mr. Burke. Are there any questions on the funding summary? Or as I have it listed on the agenda, the financial worksheet? Okay, thank you. Mr. Burke, this is a lot of work put into this to get to this point. This is a living document. It will be updated on an ongoing basis. But what you see right now is our best attempt to reconcile the financial system here and everything that we've been spending on ARPA. So extremely useful document. And thank you for creating that one page, the first page, Mr. Burke, you and your team. That helps kind of.
Bates, please. Oops,
Yeah,
please
Bates,
go
go
back.
ahead.
So when I look to the lower left-hand corner, to be determined, and the $15 million is in parentheses, that means that if we use the 5.2, we will be over by $15 million, and there will be nothing left for anything but what's listed here.
Yes, based on that math, that's what you would be. There would be no available funding to be determined. It would all be consumed with lost revenue.
Okay, so the question I'm afraid to ask is, how do we decide? Do we decide to go to the 5.2% versus 4.1%? Is that a decision this committee needs to make sooner or later?
Yeah, I can answer that, Gary. Mr. Onzig indicated that we should determine what percentage we would like to utilize as soon as possible. And so that's something we'll do in just a moment. Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Isn't that an allocation amount that we decide each and every year? We don't decide for the next 3 or 4 years. We do it each year. So whatever we would decide for this next year is just that year, and then the following year we vote again.
Yes, true. We have to do it on an annual basis. I think just for budgeting and projection purposes, Mr. Onzig wanted us to at least have some consensus of what we're looking at for this year. Any other questions or comments on this? Mr. Leonard?
Thank you. Just one more comment I'd like to make. With respect to allocations, these are not monies spent. They're just projections on what we might have to spend at these different revenue percentages. So even though this chart would show if we use the 5.2%, we would end up being about $15 million over our 103 million. Doesn't mean we have to use that. And in fact, in this case, we could not use it because we couldn't go over the 103.4 million. So once again, these are projections. These are not commitments.
Absolutely correct. Yeah. If we were to take all of the 5.2% and the payroll reimbursement, it would put us well over the mark. So yeah, these are movable numbers, but they're just helpful for us to in our planning process. Mr. Tepe.
Tepe here. The observation I would make is that since the county board has really done a very poor job of determining the kind of funding that it needs and providing the revenue sources that the county really needs, that it's pretty obvious to me that the county is going to need as much funds as it can get from the ARPA funds in order to balance its budget. I think that is just a really disturbing discussion to have and a disturbing observation to have to make. And this county needs to do a much better job and should start immediately in coming up with a plan to properly finance the county rather than relying upon the uses of these funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tepe.
Comment, Shepro.
Shepro, go ahead.
Well, I do not agree with Mr. Tepe's placing the blame on, I think he said, quote, the county board, unquote. I do have confusion there about the point that he raises, which is I hear from some sources that the money has already been spent, quote unquote, because we are using it to cover the budget shortfalls. And so I know that there hasn't been an official allocation, but I guess I am confused as to the extent of funds that would be available. I think I'm hearing again today that if we take everything to which we are legally entitled, there is in fact not only no money left, but there would be oversubscribed. Am I right?
Yes, that is correct, at the 5.2%.
Yeah, okay.
Mr. Brown.
Yeah, Gary, I think you still have control. This is Brown speaking. You still have control of the screen, right?
I do.
Could you go back to the summary? Okay, so the bottom line here is $66.6 million is what's left over to date. So whether you choose to go with the 4.1 or the 5.2, it's kind of relevant but irrelevant. $66 million is what's not committed for to date. So we could, in reality, somebody good with numbers, I guess that would be Gary, could say $66.6 million is what percentage of lost revenue that we could recoup. And we could choose to go with that number, whether it's 4.3 or 4.9, whatever it is, it's $66 million. And we could then take and say, that's the number we're going to use. So now then you have to decide how you're going to spend that $66 million. And we as a committee, as a board, could say, to make sure that we're going to be able to meet our budget obligations for the next couple of years, we're going to take $10 million, has been suggested before, per year for, say, the next 2 years, and set that aside for budget. So now you're looking at $46.6 million. So now you could look at that 46.6 and you could say, all right, whatever the number is, $40 million is what we're going to use for internal request and leave 6 for whatever other purposes we decide would be useful. Or we could take all 46, or we could take 30, whatever the number we decide to use. But I think at this point, in my mind, now that we've got these numbers in front of us, we know the real number here, we need to go further than where we've been and determine that allocation. Do we agree that we should set aside 10 million for the next 2 years, meaning a total of 20, and then take that 46, and what are we going to do with that? Or what are we going to do next? We can't keep pushing this down the road. The last meeting we had, it was suggested that we don't want to meet again until we've got real numbers. We have real numbers, so now we need to make decisions. And I would suggest that we do what I just mentioned, 10 million a year, meaning 20, set aside for budget purposes. Now, when we get to the budget, if we don't need all 10 million, that money then goes back into the 46 million. It adds to the 46. But we know we're covered until we can do what Mr. Tuppy has so often talked about, figure out a way we're going to be able to fund the budget without using these emergency funds that happen to show up.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Leonard.
Yes, I agree with Mr. Brown. I think it's a good idea. I think in allocating 4.1% or 5.2%, whatever we allocate gives us the ability and the flexibility to allocate 10 million to balancing the budget or whatever. So I think at this point, what we need to do is decide, number one, what's the percentage of allocation we want for revenue lost? And if it's over 10 million a year, say it's 16 million a year, or even 20 million a year because of the 5.2% revenue allocation loss, we can then take a portion of that to balance the budget. And we can do that not only for another year or two, but maybe 3 or 4 years. So I think until we come up with a long-term solution on balancing the budget, I think it would be prudent for this committee to recommend allocating enough money that we could balance the budget or help balance the budget each and every year for the next 2, 3, 4 years. Because I think we have about 4 years left where we can use this money. So I think that would be a key thing to do. You know, the 4.1% revenue allocation equates to what, 16.1 million right now for the next year. If we allocate 4.1% next year, we have to remember each and every year we can change that allocation. We can go up to 5.2 or we can go down. But I think for this coming year, using the 4.1 as we have and allocating 16 million gives us enough flexibility to help balance the budget and then possibly put additional funds left over, if there are any, into other areas.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Mr. Tepe.
Mr. Chair, I continue to get more and more disturbed as these discussions go on. First off, we've allocated $4 million for mental health, homeless shelters, and food banks, and we've yet to distribute those funds. And there's nothing on the agenda that even moves us to distributing those funds. So those funds aren't going to be distributed now for at least several more months. Second, there's been no discussion in regard to all of the internal requests that were made, which I believe totaled up to somewhere in excess of $30 million. Am I incorrect in that number?
60.
Wrong. It was $60 million.
60 some million. But we did come to a conclusion of 49 is what we think is
So,
appropriate.
okay, thanks, Mr. Leonard. So there's roughly $50 million in internal projects, which we felt were highly desirable to pursue and discuss. And so, the only thing that's in our way in doing the right thing for the county is balancing our budget, because the county board, regardless of what Mr. Shepro says, the county board has not done anything that'll really, in effect, provide the kind of funding that this county needs for the next several years, other than using these funds. I think we're at somewhat of a real crossroad situation where I don't know what the hell to do. So thanks, Mr. Leonard. You always have the answers associated with that.
Thank you, Mr. Tepe.
Yes, this is Mr. Martin. May I speak?
Yes, Mr. Martin, go ahead.
I agree with Vern in the context of the fact that we need to have a long-term plan to make certain that this county remains solvent. And I mean, not only agree with him, we by law are required to do it. And having said that, we have an obligation to taxpayers that we, as much as possible, balance that budget and keep their taxes as low as possible. And I don't regard it as a cheap thrill to utilize this money to balance our budget for some period of time, taken in the context of the fact that we will need at some point in time to put together the plan that will in fact balance the budget. But I've said it before, how do we have available to us this amount of money and then say, and oh, by the way, we'd like to raise your taxes? I'm as simple as any taxpayer, and it would be very difficult for me to say, I'm glad I'm paying more taxes, and I'm glad, by the way, that we have money for other projects. Our primary obligation as members of this board, in my opinion, is to support county activities. And we use taxpayer dollars to do that. Here we have taxpayers of the entire United States who have borrowed money to make money available to us to somewhat lessen the burden of taxpayers of the county of Kane. And I don't, as I say, I don't look at that as anything less than being totally appropriate, that we utilize those funds for that purpose. Do we need a long-term plan? Absolutely. Do we have money in the interim, which means that our taxpayers, our Kane County residents, will pay fewer taxes in the next year or two or whatever? I think we do, and the more money that we have to that regard, it seems also to me the more discretion that we have as to which of the internal programs that we want to support. So I think we should put money aside. I think we need to do so with a long-term thought, but I have trouble conceptualizing not making the money available for the direct financial needs of the county, and then saying, by the way, we also would like to raise your taxes. I can't imagine the conversations that would enable us all to have with our constituents.
Thank you, Mr. Martin.
Sure.
Mr. Brown?
Brown speaking here. I'd like to back up a moment if I could for some clarification, Mr. Tepe, in regard to the $4 million. We've got a application process out there right now. I believe the flow chart that's been created that we have to go by for reporting was sent out to everybody for your review. So Jarrett and Peter and Ernst & Young are working on this process. The applications are coming in, and I don't know, Jared and Mr. Chair, it's up to you if you want to ask Gary to share what who so far has applied. But there's been quite a few applications, not as many as what we hoped, for sure. But these applications are coming in. The window is open until the end of the month for these applications to be submitted. And then there's a 15-day appeal process. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes between Jarrett, Peter, and the state's attorney, finance, the treasurer, the auditor. Much to my surprise, the process we have to go through here to cut a check. So we had to go and make sure that every one of those departments understood what we were looking to do. We had conversation about how often are we going to, once these applications are approved, say they're a multi-year application, how often are we going to be able to cut the checks? What is going to be a burden to finance? What isn't going to be a burden? So each and every one of those departments I just mentioned had to weigh in on that. What could happen? How we can make this work? The good news is they were all very accommodating and very, very easy to say, we can cut checks once a week if that's what you decide you want us to do. But we need X, Y, and Z done prior to that in order for us to do that. So the $4 million is being applied for. It is being reviewed. Ernst & Young is reviewing the applications as they come in right now, so that there is no delay in cutting that check once the 15th of February passes up, because that's really the end of the day of when the application process appeal can be rectified. So on the 15th of February, basically there's going to be a recommendation that comes, I believe, Jared, if I got the flow chart right, from this committee to the executive committee, then to the full board, and the check gets cut. Now, granted, it's not as quick as what we were hoping. Now we're looking at March, probably, for that first check to be cut. We certainly hoped it was going to be sooner. I certainly found out there was a lot more behind the scenes stuff that had to be done than what we all thought. But that's just, I just wanted to answer that, make that clear that the $4 million is being worked on, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Any other questions or comments at this time? Madam Chair?
Fraz has a question.
Let Mr.
Fraz, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, and this goes way back to the early days of this committee, but when we set aside the $4 million, that was kind of a shot in the arm type thing. We wanted to be able to get it out relatively quick. So my question is, and maybe I interpreted this wrong at the time, but my thought was that, let's set aside this 4 million, but we'll probably be adding to that in the future. So I'm just not hearing much talk about that. And I'm just wondering if the applications are all falling within the $4 million allotment that's the shot in the arm allotment, or does it appear that they'll stay within that, or are they going to far exceed it?
Well, I can answer briefly, Mr. Fraz. We're definitely seeing more requests for money than we have money available. And I'll show that in a little bit when we talk about the community support grant application turnout. So we're seeing people coming in, not huge numbers yet, but the numbers requested are pretty large.
Okay, I guess, again, maybe I misinterpreted at the time, but I thought it was like, let's set this aside, make the money available for immediate needs, but there'll be more put into that bucket in the future. But that was just my thought.
Well, and that's certainly something that this committee will have to decide as we go through our recommending of a budget to the county board.
Thank you.
Madam
Bates,
Chair,
please.
and then Tepe and then Bates.
Hold on just a second. Microphone again. Thank you. Thank you for recognizing me. Mr. Frost, that was my understanding as well when that discussion was had, that this was going to be the initial outlay and then there was going to be additional money that may come forward after that. But the reason for my comments right now is this word tax. It seems like this three-letter word has turned into something that is should not be mentioned in polite company. Kane County, when we talk about the budget, has had depressed salaries for a number of years. We just heard a very robust conversation from the health department presentation, speaking about the unfortunate amount of money that we're paying for our nurses, which is why we can't get nurses for Kane County. They're making approximately 100% less, not 50, not 25, 100% less than what they should be making right now as an entry-level salary. This is going to go cross-county line. We've heard from many of our departments, our unions are going to be organizing right now to ask for additional wages, which has been deflated here in Kane County for a number of years. Now, I'm not making any judgment calls on what decisions were made in the past, because I'm sure that they were made with all the right reasons with the information that you had set forth. But we know right now that Kane County salaries are depressed. We know that there's going to be needs for our facilities. We don't need to go into great detail about that, but we know that there are needs in our facilities. This money that you're speaking of right now is of great value, it is of great help, but it's not going to fill the hole. It's a temporary plug in the dam. So why we can say whether or not we've received $200 million from the federal government, and we're grateful for that help. We have been fighting a pandemic. We've been supporting lost wages. We've been supporting depressed revenue sources, which has now been balanced back up. But the bottom line is that the real issue is that we're not taking in enough revenue here in the county. So however we try to massage this and saying that that word tax, Kane County is one of the lowest taxing bodies in the county. So I can't, in this seat right now, I can't say that, yes, our taxes are high. My tax on my condo is about $6,900 a year. But where's the most of that money coming from or going to? It's not going to the county. It's going to other taxing bodies. So I would be reluctant to say, as we go to our constituents, as we start, many of you on the campaign trail this year, that we lump the county into the entire soup of taxes, because we're a very small tax levy. I think that's very important for our constituents to understand. And I'm going to ask you, where do you cut? At what point, what services do you want to cut to be able to maintain the discipline of your budget? So I think my My remarks are just based on what I see as a critical spreadsheet. It's black and white. There's so much revenue coming in, so much future expenses that are going to be going out. And how are we going to balance that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Tepe and then Ms. Bates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tepe here. I want to go back to the discussion regarding the comments from Mr. Froz. When the $4 million was discussed and approved, there was an allocation of that $4 million where $2 million of that was to go to mental health. And then I believe there was an understanding where that $2 million was going to be equally divided among 5 key mental health organizations in the county. I'm sorry, 6 key mental health organizations. Is that still in effect, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Okay, so we've known the amount of money that needs to go to these organizations now for several months. So I don't understand why there has to be a continual delay in distributing those funds. Sometimes you can complete the paperwork after you distribute the funds, but the key thing is these funds are being distributed to help them retain key personnel. And the delay still bothers me, but I wanted to make sure that agreement was still in effect regardless of the time period.
Yeah, just to keep in mind, the application portal is still open and it remains open until January 31st. So for the majority of the categories, there's not going to be any money sent out until that window closes, until everything gets processed by our consultant. With the big 6 categories, we haven't received all of the applications from those big 6 yet. We thought we would get those in probably the next day. We did get a couple. So those are being treated a little bit differently. They don't have to go through any kind of review or approval process for the board. So once they have expenses to submit, they will get checks cut to them immediately. They don't have to wait for January 31st or February 15th for the appeal process. So that category is being treated differently because it's a non-competitive.
Okay,
grant.
thank you.
Ms. Bates?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would like to thank Mr. Froz for your comments because I want to agree with those comments 100% that $4 million towards a community, I believe was just a start and just a small start at that. I would like to bring us back to a topic I have brought up before, which is what is our real lost revenue? I believe Mr. Onsick in some of our first discussions on this topic said that it was maybe 2% was the real lost revenue from the pandemic. So I feel like we are taking away from our own future to use this money to fill budget gaps. We're borrowing from our future, and if we end up having in some sad way having to use so much of this money for budget gaps, I believe we're robbing from our future, and we would owe some of these future internal projects and external projects future money. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bates. Are there any other questions or comments at this point?
Mr. Chairman, this is Alan.
Ms. Allen, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not on your committee, but it sure is a pleasure to see you guys think and work. I am grateful for all the time that you're putting in on this. I wanted to say that I thought Mr. Brown was trying to find that reasonable medium. Mr. Onsick said we needed about 7 million for 2021. Mr. Brown was suggesting that 10 million might be a good set aside for future years. I am going to ask the question that in the figures that we've seen so far, for instance, in public safety and public health, none of their special projects are included in those numbers. Am I correct? So we are still waiting to see how we can work in, as Ms. Bates said, the future of the good that we can do for our constituents with the projects that our internal staff said, here is something that I wanted to do for years. It's going to benefit, fill in the blank. It's going to benefit this part of the county. And that's why they worked so hard. And you as a committee worked so hard on vetting those programs so that we can see them and consider them for the use of this very special money coming into us to help everyone that we serve. Thanks for the time, Mr. Chairman and committee.
No problem, Ms. Allen. Good to hear from you. Mr. Brown?
Yeah, Ms. Allen, thank you for your comments. Yeah, you're right. The 10 million I was talking about would be 2 years of 10 million each. That'd be 20 million. So out of the 66 million that is left over to date, that would bring us down to 46 million. So those projects you just referred to, the special projects that our departments are saying, we've been trying to get this moving for years, or we need this for that. It would increase revenue if we do this. Those projects, then we could turn Ernst & Young loose because they've already made those applications. We could turn Ernst & Young loose to start reviewing those applications to see if they do indeed fit into the criteria that the Treasury Department has set. And then we could start saying as a board, yes, we agree, no, we don't agree that we want to fund those specific projects that would qualify. So those projects you're referring to are a part of that $46 million that would be left over under my thought.
Mr. Chair, Bates, please.
Ms. Bates?
I think Mr. Brown's making a lot of sense. And the more math I do scribbling here, I think maybe that's one of our best middle grounds.
Thank you, Ms. Bates.
Shepro?
Shepro, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I continue to be puzzled by some of the communications we've been getting. For example, apparently Ernst & Young believes that much of the projects that have emanated from some of our departments are eligible to be funded by other grant programs. And then I guess there's some question about whether they can legally give us that advice because it's beyond the scope of their engagement. I sort of baffled by all that and wondering if we have a handle, because that's obviously a very key aspect to what happens to the remaining money. If we have other sources, then a lot of the problems we've been discussing, I think, go away or at least minimized. And I'm not sure I understand where we stand with that.
So that's the next discussion item, Mr. Shepro. So we'll get into that in a moment.
Yeah.
To add some more clarity to the situation. Okay, any other questions or comments at this point? So for our next meeting, just taking some of the comments made today, and Peter and myself will be following up with committee members to get some more input on ideas for how members would like to slice this budget up. We want to have a presentation that at least outlines maybe a couple different options, 2 or 3 different options of how we could do it. And then based on everyone's comments, and then start to make some decisions on what our budget is going to be, our recommended budget to the county board is going to be for these funds. Madam Chair.
Keep hitting the wrong mic. Just a quick question as a follow-up then. So if we're going to have another presentation, which is fine, when are we going to start looking at the allocation, the potential allocation for the internal requests?
Well, it's a part of the whole conversation, essentially. How much money is going to end up being devoted to those internal requests? Are we going to fund all of them? Are we going to decide, well, we only have $30 million to spend on that, and then we go through a process of selecting which ones? You know, these are to be determined decisions to make at this point. I think it sounds like the biggest question is, how much revenue recoupment are we going to take and what is it going to be used for? Is some of it going to be set aside for budgetary purposes, actual revenue loss? Is all of it going to be set aside for that purpose, or will some of that be directed into departmental requests and potential other uses, as Mr. Brown had suggested? And that's one component. We have the payroll reimbursement component, which is another avenue by which we can fund some department requests and or other considerations as well. That to be determined amount in Mr. Onzik's projections, after you take out the revenue recoupment and payroll reimbursement, that number is just shrinking by the day. I mean, just with the $4 million program, with administrative costs, with other things, you know, that to be determined looks more and more like it's not the major player in our conversations. But these department requests can be handled within revenue recoupment. That is a possibility. So we have to keep that in mind. It's not just budgetary stuff. And the payroll reimbursement has no limitations. Once we're reimbursed for those payroll expenses, that money can be used on anything. It doesn't even have to be reported if we choose not to. So just so everyone understands, the department requests, that's a part of the whole conversation. So we have to kind of tackle it all at once and move the pieces around and come to some kind of consensus together on how we're going to do this, at least what we're recommending to the board. Because keep in mind, this committee is a recommendation body. We don't set the budget and then the county board has to say, yes, we follow this. It has to be approved at that level after we come to our own conclusions. Mr. Brown?
Brown speaking again.
Excuse me, Mr. Brown, if I
Chair.
may, just
Yeah,
as a
follow
follow-up. on that. So with your recommendation that is going to be coming out of this committee, it's going to go directly then to finance, the finance committee for their considerations. And this may, usually it goes through finance and it goes up the food chain. But this conversation may go back and forth for a little bit, potentially, as we're fine tuning what we're going to be using this very precious resource for. Because if there's all these opportunities and we project all these opportunities, I think it's very important that both finance and this committee are very comfortable with that mapping process. So we know what the spreadsheet looks like and agreed upon before it goes up to any other committee. Because there's some very important decisions that have to be made about what we're going to be funding, what it's going to look like, the health of the county's resources, our not-for-profit partners, which we know that they have great needs, more needs than we can possibly ever hope to satisfy, as well as our internal requests that will greatly benefit the work of the county, including economic impact and economic growth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Brown?
Kind of lost my train of thought listening to Madam Chair, but I think where I was going to go with my next comment was to backtrack on Mr. Sheprow's comment. And I know the next item on the agenda is the FEMA funding opportunities. I think maybe some of the concerns and questions the committee is having could be answered if we went into this FEMA update. And then I think I've got an idea that I'm going to propose after you discuss or we discuss what's happening here with potential FEMA.
Okay, yeah, let's move on. There is one thing again, Mr. Onzik has some apprehension about not knowing what percentage we would want to take for revenue recoupment. We did 4.1% for 2020. Is there any objection from anyone on this committee to utilizing that same percentage again for this year? Okay, that's what I assumed, but just wanted to make sure that we had that in discussion.
Mr. Chairman, Bates,
Ms.
please.
Bates?
Sorry to interrupt, but you said that the department internal projects can be used from the recoupment money. I didn't understand that before. I thought.
Yeah, so the revenue recoupment money can be used for government services. So any of those department requests that can be considered a government service would be eligible under that category of revenue recoupment, revenue loss.
But I thought the revenue recoupment was just going for items that were already budgeted.
That's not my understanding unless Mr. Coyle from the state's attorney's office sees it differently.
Benzie Coyle from the King County State's Attorney's Office. So the revenue recoupment is, as Mr. Leonard had described before, is an allocation, and it's a category under the ARPA Act, the American Rescue Plan Act, and you can use that allocation for any government service that this county provides. So if you take the 4.1%, that is an allocation, and you can use that money for government services, which may also include the internal projects. It is up to this committee's recommendation as to how they want to use the revenue recoupment if it's allocated.
Thank you.
And Ms. Bates, not to add complexity to this, but just as an example, if we, we take a certain amount for revenue recoupment, we utilize it for, say budgetary purposes, but then we realize there's something that wouldn't necessarily be under that category that we do want to fund. That money from revenue recoupment can be moved to a different category. So it's pretty fluid until we report it to the Treasury Department.
Do we think realistically that can happen?
Realistically, it can happen. It's just, we have to come up with our. Can you hear us?
Thank you.
Okay. I think we covered that. Okay, so there's another issue of, before we get to the full FEMA conversation, just real quick, wanted to get a consent from the committee on, at this point, just having Ernst & Young go through our department requests, not in any great detail, but just to determine this one could be eligible for FEMA funding, and this one is better for ARPA. Just separating them into those two piles, which also will help us in our budgeting process. Is there any objection to having Ernst & Young complete that not too thorough view? Mr. Brown?
Sounds good.
I was anticipating that some of the committee members might say, well, what's this about FEMA? What might be eligible and why are we talking about this?
Mr. Tepe.
That would be me.
All right, so sorry, I might have put that in the wrong place.
While Mr. Brown brings it up.
So here's the situation with the FEMA funding opportunities. We've known that there is potential for some real savings there. Ernst & Young did a quick glance at our COVID-related expenses that we approved earlier in the year that ultimately totaled, I think, about $1.2 million, and they found $600,000 that could be recouped from FEMA. So that just gives us some indication of the potential savings that might be found in our department requests. And they've indicated that just based on the categories, there are quite a few that should be able to be eligible for FEMA funding. We don't know what that number is going to be. And that's why I wanted to ask, do you want us to have Ernst & Young separate for now our department requests into piles? The reason we're not saying, hey, Ernst & Young, just do it all for us is because in conversation with the state's attorney's office, we determined that the statement of work for Ernst & Young is very clearly defined only for ARPA administration purposes. So they can help in advising us in matters regarding FEMA applications and do things like separate into piles which ones would be eligible or not, because they have subject matter experts that worked for FEMA. We were just on a conversation with last week. I mean, they have the people that can do this, but they can't fill out the paperwork. They can't turn it in for us and do a lot of that grunt work for submitting the FEMA. So that means we have to then go out to RFP. Another option that we are exploring right now, Mr. Phillips and myself, is do we have staff resources at the county amongst our various departments and offices? Could we assemble a team of a few people that would be able to do this with some help from Ernst & Young? Obviously only in what they're able to do. And the state's attorney's office is looking into all the things that Ernst & Young could do for us regarding FEMA based on a current statement of work. So plan A right now is to just see if we could put together a team. If it's feasible for the departments, the department heads and officials sign off on, is that something that we can do in-house with a little assistance from our friends? Or if not, and this is something we have to figure out very quickly, or if not, we have to go out for RFP. We have to issue an RFP to hire a firm to perform those services for us, to submit the FEMA applications for the whole county. Ernst & Young could very well be selected to do that, but we have to go through the official procurement process that would open it up to other firms potentially, and then go from there. So it takes a little bit longer. We are under the impression originally that we had a much shorter deadline. We were thinking the end of April, but it turns out we have a longer deadline. So if we go the RFP route, we have time for that. We can, it can happen. It can be accomplished.
Shepro, question and comment?
Mr. Tepe had his hand up and then Shepro.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the quandary, but I think the quandary goes a little bit deeper. Okay, does this committee have the authority to start dealing with FEMA? So I don't think it was in the purview of the agreement with Ernst and Young, nor do I think it was in the purview of the organization of this committee. So I think we better also get approval from the board to go and do this. Maybe that's just a technical thing because it just makes logical sense.
Yeah,
And it makes
so-
logical sense to me. But it also puts us on a track of taking our individual departments that report to other committees and taking over some of the management of those functions from other committees. So
Yeah.
let's
so-
make sure we're not making other people unhappy, which I'm very good at doing.
Well, absolutely. If we were to do this in-house, it would have to be with the blessing of department heads and elected officials and the county board. So what we're doing is exploratory.
That makes logical sense.
Yeah, we're just exploring the option, seeing if there's any possibility. Otherwise, we're just going to go to RFP and do it that way, which takes a little bit longer. Mr. Leonard?
Shepro first.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Mr. Shepro.
Yeah, the more comments that we make, and I refer to most Mr. Brown and Mr. Tepe, it seems to me that before you get any kind of a consensus, we ought to have the discussion that is apparently forthcoming on exactly what's involved before there's any committee consensus developed. And I guess my comment is also that the more I listen to this, the more complicated. I mean, I wouldn't take second place to anybody in my advocacy for process, but what's just been outlined, we're drowning in too much process. And I think we should be examining the initial premise that somehow this is so far beyond the authority of the people we've hired that we have to start over again. And I think that at least merits a discussion before that you ask the committee for a consensus as to who should be doing what.
Are you saying we need to have a discussion on what the statement of work for Ernst and Young is?
No, I think that you were promising and the agenda states that there's going to be a discussion about what FEMA, that whole issue that I brought up and you said was next on the agenda before asking the committee for a consensus as to, in a sense, how they want to deal with it.
Well, the only consensus I was seeking from the committee today is if at this point they would like Ernst and Young to look at our department requests and to find ones that would be eligible for FEMA funding to help us in our budget planning.
And isn't
process.
that basically what this next discussion is supposed to be about?
Well, the discussion we're having on FEMA funding opportunities was an update to let everyone know why Ernst and Young isn't at this time pursuing the FEMA grants for us.
Well, if they're pursuing them, why do we have to decide whether they should do that? I mean, I guess.
Mr. Shepro, they're not, based on their statement of work, they're not able to do the FEMA work for us. They can look at our request and say, hey, these ones are eligible for FEMA. These are only eligible for ARPA. They can do that. But outside of that, there's not much more that they can do. The state's attorney.
Well, I thought you were saying that they can't fill out a form.
Right. Yeah, they can't submit the applications. And do
Okay,
some of the
but
work.
they can give us advice.
They can advise us, yes.
And isn't that what we're looking for at this point is to find out what opportunities are out there? I mean, they don't have to fill out a piece of paper to do that.
And they're doing that. And
Okay, I am more, the longer this discussion goes on, the more baffled I am as to the sequence. And I think the real questions that Mr. Brown and Mr. Tepe have raised are being sort of considered out of the proper order.
Thank you, Mr. Shepro. Mr. Leonard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Leonard speaking. I think what we're looking at might be a little bit more simple than what we're trying to accomplish here, and that is if Ernst & Young can make recommendations about potential FEMA funding, can't we give those to all the different departments and have them pursue those? I understand Ernst & Young can't do the application of the paperwork, but if they can identify for us where there is potential funding, then can't each and every department that has potential FEMA funding apply for that funding? And then we can find out what FEMA funding we're getting and then hopefully reduce what we need to use in the rescue funds.
Yeah, and that's
Here,
another
here.
way of saying what I
Here, here.
said earlier. So thank you, Mr. Leonard, for paraphrasing that. Madam Chair?
So just to clarify, this committee is going to ask Ernst & Young to pull out all the internal applications that are only available for ARPA funds. And they will review those. Any applications that may also be available for FEMA funds, those will be distributed back to the department heads for further research on their end to see if they can apply for FEMA. Is that what I'm hearing?
The way I understand it is we're going to ask them to create a list that shows which of our department requests are FEMA eligible. So
Mhm.
that we can say, well, if we do go after this and this is what we'll get, that's the savings out of ARPA. So these department requests are all ARPA related over here. So we can fund those with ARPA money. So all we're asking them to do right now is just take a look at the 68 or 69 requests that came in and separate them. FEMA, ARPA, FEMA, ARPA. Which ones can we go after for FEMA? And then it's up to us to determine how we want, as a county, how we want to apply for those funds. Are we going to do that in-house, using our departments that could apply for these funds? Or are we going to have a firm do that for us as an entire county?
All right, that I understand.
Mhm.
So next steps would be do the separation.
Mhm.
The ARP, primarily the requests that are only for ARP money will come back to this committee for discussion. Those that are also available potentially for FEMA funding, then will go back to the departments for their review. Then they can fill out the grant application independently, perhaps, if they have the capacity, which is something yet to be decided. If they have the capacity, then we sit and wait to see if those funds are awarded to those departments. And then we review once more. So we have to make sure that ARP, that's the process. So the ARP money that will be allocated to those opportunities that are only can be funded through ARP will have to be measured so that we don't expend all of the money on those other requests. So we save money for FEMA because they may be eligible for both. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and it's certainly in our best interest. Anything that we can get through FEMA, we should go after.
Oh, absolutely.
And something also that we learned, if we were to go out to RFP and hire a firm, which very well could be Ernst & Young, to do the administration of that grant application for FEMA, those costs are recoverable from the grant itself, up to, I believe, 5%.
Admin costs,
of
of
the total.
course, okay.
So through the FEMA reimbursement we would potentially get, the administrative costs could be covered. So we wouldn't have any additional costs from the county.
So then why don't we just get that done? I mean, if that's the case, what's the discussion? I mean, send out the RFP, you've got nothing to lose.
Well, we don't have to send it.
Yeah, well, again, this has been moving. We just learned about this topic on last Tuesday. And since then, things have changed. And originally, like I had mentioned, we had the understanding that we had until the end of April, but there's a bunch of subtleties to it, but we have longer than April to turn it in. So that's why we started to look into the possibility of exploring doing this internally. At this point, personally, I would think that an RFP would be the simplest process. It just takes a little bit longer. But if we have staff on hand that can handle this, I know some board members at least would want us to know that, to explore that.
Well, how long is the RFP? 30 days
30
Just-
days. Yeah.
to send it out?
I like your attitude on this.
Yeah, send it out.
Mr. Chairman?
Hold on, Mr. Leonard had a comment.
You know, I just wanted to mention that with respect to the 5% fee that is charged, the departments could get reimbursed too if they do it. And quite honestly, I think department heads have a responsibility to look at any potential reimbursement or funding they can get for their budget. So my suggestion is, let's let Ernst & Young identify the FEMA projects, potential FEMA projects. We then give those to those departments and say, apply for this FEMA money, and then get a response back. If we want to go through the RFP and have Ernst & Young do it, yeah, we can do that, and we'll get reimbursed one way or another. But the bottom line is, I think really the departments have a responsibility to look at ways to help
Perfect.
reduce the budget. So I say, go to the departments, give all the FEMA eligible potential monies to them for their different requests. Take that out of the ARPA consideration right now until we get a resolution from FEMA on each and every one of them.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Mr. Brown.
Brown speaking. Good comments. Let me take us back a little bit. When Ernst & Young told us, and they introduced a gentleman that is on their firm, actually, they've got quite a few people on their firm that are very experienced in the FEMA revenue, or the FEMA area. They identified many things that have already been paid for out of the CARES Act that were most likely FEMA reimbursable, that have been paid for out of the CARES Act. They've identified a lot of items out of what's been applied for that could most likely be FEMA reimbursable. They also identified things that are happening that could be and should be FEMA reimbursable. Something as simple as the deputy that sits at the front door. He's there because of COVID, making sure everybody's wearing a mask and making sure everybody's got their temperature checked. That is an expense that we've talked about at the Public Safety Committee quite often, of $90,000 of overtime every 6 months to pay for the deputy. That is something that hasn't been applied for through FEMA, but is most likely eligible. So when we say, let our departments do this, I'm concerned that as good as they are, they might not have the expertise needed to identify everything that is or could be FEMA eligible. And then do they have the time to make those applications and to try to push for that money? That's a whole nother story, a whole nother subject. But what I'm thinking is that Ernst & Young has proven to me in the phone calls that I've been on with them, that they have got the expertise, they've got the knowledge to go after money that's eligible to the county, that will indeed then save the county money through many different areas that we don't know about. And I think that's why you hire the consultants that you hire, because you need them for their consulting expertise. So in just the phone calls I've been on with them, I mean, there's been a lot of concern going back and forth about what they can do, what they can't do. It took quite some time for the state's attorney's office to look into it. And I don't know that we've still got any final resolution on what they can do and what they can't do. So back to Mr. Teppe's point about why isn't this done? Well, again, we're waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and everybody's busy. But whether it's an RFP, what it is, my personal opinion is we ought to let Ernst & Young go through these applications we have, make the 2 different piles as Jared has talked about, but then somehow or another, whether it's Ernst & Young or another consultant that would come back that we feel more comfortable with for pursuing the FEMA money, I think we need to let that process happen all on its own. And the benefit of that, you guys got to realize, is that the money we're talking about here, it's huge. Well, so when we're talking about, are we going to give another $1 million or $5 million to the community investment? By God, if we get, $5 million or $10 million reimbursed to us through FEMA, look at what we can do. We can still do all the internal things and we can still help more in the community, possibly. I don't know. But the opportunity for more recoupment is absolutely huge, but you have to have the people on board that have got the expertise to do it and not slow the process down. That's where we're going to run into a problem. If you hand this pile of FEMA eligible expenses and Ernst & Young's opinion back to all the different department heads, when are they going to do it? And in the meantime, one of them might be an application for a van for the health department to go into the community for vaccines. That is one, quite honestly, that Ernst & Young has identified that is absolutely 100% reimbursable for FEMA because they're reacting to an emergency. They're reacting to a pandemic. So not only is that van reimbursable, the people that operate it are, the expense to operate it are. So they know this. Let them apply for it. In the meantime, we could take the money out of ARPA. If they're that 100% convinced that it's eligible, we could order this van, we could get this moving, and then FEMA will reimburse us. But let the experts handle this rather than handing it back to the health department that is in here saying that they're understaffed and they can't hire people. How are they going to do it? And again, if Ernst & Young does it or any other firm does it, their fee is reimbursable. So why are we trying to burden our departments more than they already are? Let the experts do this.
It's fine.
Very well said, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Leonard's and Mr. Brown's points are they're not the same, but they're very good and good angles.
I would
for us to
defer,
consider.
this is Leonard, I would defer to Mr. Brown's suggestion. If we can do it in 30 days and get it done and have the pros do it, they're probably going to be able to find more money and fill out the applications better than department heads. So I think it's worth the 30 days, if it is 30 days, to go through the professionals, do the RFP and move forward. But let's move forward today and let's take action today on that.
Is there anyone on the committee that would, hold on, Ms. Bates, is there anyone on the committee that would oppose to us just simply going straight to the RFP process?
No.
No?
Can we
Well, I
make a
think-
motion? Do we need a motion?
No, we don't need a
No
motion.
need.
It's just discussion and
Okay.
consent. Well, I think that's the way we'll go then.
Good,
Good, good.
good.
RFP. Hear that, Vince? Start writing. He's like, oh, you guys.
Mr. Chair, if I could, so now that we've got that decided on, now I think we could, as I said, circle back, because I think I've hopefully identified that there could be a huge opportunity for future recoupment. So now if we could circle back to how we're going to distribute this money, rather than us thinking about it for another couple of weeks and deciding how much money we're going to put into what bucket, I would recommend that we take that $66 million that is now left over to date, whatever percentage of revenue recoupment that is, take that $66 million, determine right now that we're going to put 20 million into a bucket for future budgetary expenses, and the other 46 million goes into other requests. I don't know how you want to identify that, but some of it would be the department requests that Ernst & Young has identified are not FEMA reimbursable, so we can get that process moving. And some of it would be, we don't know until Ernst & Young goes through the request. Out of the $49 million that the intercompany requests are, it may be that there's 39 million that are needed and 10 million could possibly be FEMA. So out of that 40, I'm starting to lose track of my numbers now, out of that 40 some million dollars that's left over after we take the 20 million out of the 66, we now fund the inter-department request, and the rest of the money then we can say is eligible for what other program we want to come up with. But we can do that all today with consensus of the committee without thinking about it for another couple of weeks.
I'm not sure that we are, or if we would need a resolution to create those allocations. Vince, could you?
So any recommendation that this committee is going to give to the county board of how to allocate it would be through resolution. So therefore you would need to have that on the agenda.
Okay, Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. my thought is if we have roughly $66 million left and we allocate all of that over the next few years to lost revenue, we can then decide how to use that money. It's a simpler process and it gives us more flexibility.
Agreed.
So I think our resolution should say we would like to allocate the full amount that is available, 66 million, to lost revenue allocation. Now, allocation, once again, is not committing it to anything. It's just giving us the ability to then allocate that money. So I think the resolution should be written up in such form that we allocate the remaining 66 million to lost revenue over the next 3 or 4 years. And then we can decide, or even better, the finance committee can decide how to allocate that lost revenue monies as it comes in each and every year to balance the budget, to do whatever.
Bates, please.
Ms. Bates?
I would respectfully to Mr. Leonard, I would like to go back to Mr. Brown's proposal. I feel like if we allocate all this money to lost revenue, we'll never get it back. And by Mr. Brown's suggestion puts a little bit of, it keeps us with some discretionary decisions on how this money should be spent. Who knows, Mr. Leonard, maybe later we'll end up in the lost revenue column. But for now, I would like to go with Mr. Brown's suggestion, the 66 million minus 20 million leaving 46 million for other requests, minus the FEMA requests, et cetera. So please, let's go with Mr. Brown's suggestion of 20 million for budgetary purposes.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a comment? This is John Martin.
Mr. Martin, go ahead.
That what I see this morning, and I'll be glad to be corrected, but it seems to me that we're trying to deal with a multitude of moving topics, including having no idea what the significance is going to be of FEMA reimbursements, and yet we're trying to arrive at a number, and we don't have a basis for making the decision. And if in fact we can acquire the ability to answer some of these questions without making a commitment today by saying, well, we will take this money as reimbursement. If that doesn't commit us to a course of action, if that just simply retains our flexibility, I would feel more comfortable doing what Mr. Leonard suggests, because we're dealing with a bunch of numbers that could all change, and we're making a final decision on what we're going to ask for revenue. And we don't have we have no baseline here. We are whistling in the dark. I'm a little bit upset, and I would hope that the RFP the next time around includes enough discretion on the part of a consultant here that tangential issues can be addressed without losing, stride again for another 30 days to get a description that enables us to fill out a form that seems to me should have, in logic, flown from original activity. I mean, they were engaged to tell us, to advise us what to do and how best to utilize these funds and to comment on them. And it would seem to me by implication absolutely clear that what they may have determined while it was done was that there could be other sources, and to suggest then that we find out now there's another source, so we need to hire another consultant or put it back out, it kind of makes me question the context of the RFP that was so narrow. So I would hope that this next RFP is broad enough that the description of work gives the committee enough opportunity to deal with some of these unknowns as they arise, and not require every time that we have to go back to the bidding process. I don't want to ramble on, but I am reticent ever to make a final decision based upon having no knowledge of numbers. We don't know what the FEMA number is. We don't know much of anything at this point in time. And holding all of our cards in our hands, if we can do that and maintain future flexibility, I would be more comfortable with it.
Mr. Chair, I would, since Ms. Bates agreed with my comment, I would like to make a comment that I would agree with Mr. Martin and Mr. Leonard on this, and I would hope Ms. Davis would as well, to try to get some finality to it. I think we're accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish doing that.
Well said.
Yeah, there we go.
Question, please.
Per Ms. Bates.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, for agreeing with everybody. That's really kind of you. So Mr. Leonard is worried about flexibility. I believe some other of you are worried about maybe putting some direction on some of these funds. Finality. Mr. Leonard is worried about, that was John Martin, I think. I was worried about finality. I suspect that if we go with Mr. Brown's proposal of $20 million to go into the budgetary funds, that is not the final word ever. And if something should change and we feel like we need to take more money for budgetary purposes, that it could always be revisited. But for now, I would like to see us set our direction on some of this money by still taking the $20 million from the $66 million and directing the other $46 million to projects. And Mr. Leonard will still stay flexible just in case. Okay? Yes?
Thank you, Ms. Bates. Let me speak and pretend I'm a committee member for a minute. I would be most comfortable proceeding with this whole budget conversation if I first knew how much we could get from FEMA, because it'll just help us overall. I like the ideas of flexibility, but I'm also keeping in mind that we're not having this conversation in a vacuum. The public does pay attention to many extents. They want to know how we're going to be spending this money. The more clear and specific we can be, the better. But the idea of flexibility is also, I think, paramount because there are so many unknowns. And as Mr. Martin said, a lot of moving pieces. With timelines. There are varying opinions on what our resolution for a budget should look like. Would everyone be more comfortable by waiting for first getting those FEMA numbers so that we know what is there before we start to really put together a resolution and a budget? No?
Well, Mr.
How
Chair,
long would that
you
take?
could be, thank you, Mavis. You could be talking months and months. The way I understand it, what would have to happen first is by April 15th or April 30th, something like that. There's a letter of.
No, I'm sorry. Hold on, Mr. Brown, before you keep going. What I mean is having Ernst & Young just look at our department requests, separate FEMA from ARPA.
Okay.
Just that, not the full exercise. Just getting that number. And Gary, are you still on the line? Do you have an estimated time, just off the top of your head? We're not going to hold you to it if, conditions change. Can you estimate how long that would take for Ernst & Young to go through our department requests and separate them into those two piles?
Yeah, Jared, based on what I understand, sorry, Mr. Sanchez, what I understand, it should be a matter of days, probably within a week, maybe in 2 weeks at the very longest. But by the next meeting, we should have a pile for you in both categories.
With no RFP required, correct?
No, correct, Ms. Bates.
This has got nothing to do with that.
Yeah, that's separate. So is the committee comfortable with waiting for that list so that we have a sense of the dollar amounts, the projects that are FEMA eligible, and then kind of coming towards some consensus for how we're going to budget or recommend a budget? Because I'm hearing a lot of different ideas. So it's going to take some time to collect everyone's thoughts and put a resolution together that at least starts to make most of us happy. Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're still going to have numbers that we don't know. There are going to be a lot of numbers we're not going to know after the FEMA is done. You have to realize that even once we identify the FEMA eligible request, some are going to be accepted, some aren't. We're going to have administrative costs. We're going to have all these other things. All I'm saying, and to Ms. Bates' concern, we're not going to be unfair to anyone. And we need to have the flexibility to give money externally or internally. And the very best way to exercise that flexibility is by allocating the remaining 66 million into lost revenue, which then can be allocated in any way we want. If we define certain amount for balancing a budget or whatever, or FEMA costs or everything else, it's going to take months before we truly know. Because even though Ernst & Young can identify FEMA eligible, we won't know whether or not those awards are made probably for another month or two. So I'm saying, let's just put the 66 million into a revenue allocation reserve. And then we can pass that reserve as we get our numbers together to the finance committee for their review and then on to executive and county board. I don't think this committee has to make financial decisions on our budget. We just have to allocate the money that we're receiving into reasonable allocations. And I think putting everything into one resolution stating this is the amount of money we're putting in the resolution doesn't mean we can't change it, as Ms. Bates said before. We can always amend that resolution. I just think this is something that we need to do today, because if we wait 2 more weeks, I think we're going to come to the same answer.
Well, no matter what we do, we have to do it via resolution. So we do have to wait 2 weeks for anything.
But we have to
What goes
decide
into
what the
resolution?
resolution is going to be, how that's going to be written. That's kind of the key. So I think what we have to do today is decide how we're going to write the resolution.
Mr. Chairman, Fraz?
Mr. Fraz?
Yeah, just a question. I guess, first of all, I wish we had a whiteboard, a dry erase board, because in my mind, I'm trying to keep all this stuff scattered around. But anyways, Mr. Leonard, with your set aside you just discussed, that would be separate from the internal request pile?
It would encompass everything. So that $66 million allocation that we would make through resolution would give us the ability to spend the money internally, externally, any way we want.
Okay, so that, I mean, if you add up the internal requests and the lost revenue and the nonprofits, I guess I'm at a point where I just want to see a list of kind of those tranches of money, you know, the 3 or 4, and then we can work off of them with the FEMA money as it comes forward, or the recommendations come back. But I also do agree that, especially Mr. Burke commented very positively, I think we should keep it simple and let them take a first blush look at that FEMA money.
Well, is there anyone on the committee that would disagree with Mr. Leonard's idea to, in our resolution, just budget to allocate the full revenue recoupment, and then as just a placeholder essentially that we'd recommend to the board, and then go as we go along the calendar, determine what we're going to do with all that money?
Yes, I would.
Yes,
Debbie,
I would.
I would
I would
object to it.
disagree. I would too.
Okay. Mr. State's Attorney, do we need full consensus, or we don't, right? Just a majority?
So this is not a final action.
Not a
so,
final action.
Certainly, if there's a resolution that you want our office to assist with, that can be presented, and then a vote can go for the final action recommendation to the county board. So if that is a resolution that you want our office to help with, we can help with that.
Obviously, that is a very simple way to go about it. So anyone that would disagree with that, ultimately, it would need to be in a form of an amendment. So that's something that we'll need to think about if anyone would want to change from that course.
Mr. Chair,
Shepro, comment?
Ms. Bates and then Shepro?
I'll let Shepro go first and see what he's got to say.
Shepro, then Bates.
Thank you. I think maybe I misunderstand this. I think Mr. Leonard's point is that the allocation he's talking about is not a decision, it's a portal, it's a bucket. once you decide you're going to put it into that bucket, all things are possible. And so I think that's, and Bill, am I on the right track there?
Yeah, exactly.
So, when you say you don't want to do that, or somebody says they don't want to do that, it's a decision to keep your options open when we're not in a position today to close them. So, and I think if you look at it in that standpoint, it seems to me that it's follows along the very eloquent remarks of Mr. Brown earlier. So I would just urge everybody that is the right way to go, because it's not a final decision, as I think the state's attorney said. It's a mechanism by which you preserve your ability to make those decisions after you get your feedback.
Thank you, Mr. Shepro. Bates and then Tepe.
I want to hear what Tepe has to say. I'm
then
staying on the stack.
I think our objection is to the naming of deferred revenue. I think it's the implication that it's deferred revenue that the county's going to keep for its. But if we talk about, okay, this is what we want to allocate now, that part we would agree with. I think it was the nomenclature that we were objecting to.
I think the nomenclature is necessary legally to preserve that bucket.
But calling it
Okay,
deferred
Mr. Chair,
revenue is.
Bates, please.
I would just like to thank you two gentlemen for using the word nomenclature twice in one day. It's been a long time since that's happened. Ms. Bates.
With my work on working with statewide issues, there's a word that we call swept. Once upon a time, there was like $100 million for environmental issues, and that all got swept into the big budget and never comes out again. I feel like by allocating this in such a general way, this money could be swept into the general fund and never seen again. And that's why I'm still urging that we go with Mr. Brown's issue idea that from the 66 million, we take out 20 million. More money could be allocated to the budgetary issues, but if we want to do something for the future of Kane County, we should not just be putting all this money into the possibility of it never coming out of this great big bucket again. So if we are going to propose a resolution today, Madam Chair, are you cheering me or are you?
No, I'm not cheering you right now because I'm putting the responsibility right back on you, Ms. Bates. You're in charge of the budget. And I'm looking at you right now. I see your picture on
Okay,
the
hello.
screen. You have a vote on this and the budget is not going to be amended or changed until November. So if this sweeping, well, you've got the broom and you've got the handle. You have the whole, you have it. It's yours, as well as it's yours for every other of the other 23 board members. This is your budget. It's not the state's. We're not sweeping anything anywhere. We're just going to be putting, if you approve this, it really is just going into a bank account.
Right.
And there it is, and it's going to be saved. And then you're all going to come together, all 24 of you at one point, differently, perhaps at different times. You're all going to come together to see how that money is going to be spent. And what I have to share with you is that the keeper of those funds, which is all 24 of you, realize the importance of the organization, not only the general budget to sweep it, but if we're going to use that word, but also to sweep it into opportunities. Now, whether or not that using that van is appropriate use for that money, I don't know. I don't know if that's appropriate use. Is there water safety and security issues that may be more important? That's going to be something for all of you to discuss. But the FEMA money, I agree with Mr. Leonard. I agree with Mr. Brown. I don't like to count the money until the check's in the bank. So we could say that the money is potentially an opportunity, but it's an opportunity to be explored. But once we get the check, we can celebrate the purchase of whatever we're going to be buying with that money. But I would not count on it right now. So please don't use the craziness of a state budget for Kane County's money. I would support putting it in a holding pattern until it can be defined more appropriately. I think that's a great suggestion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering if there is more discussion on this. Obviously, I guess we need to continue, but I would like to ask if possible, and Vince is here, maybe you could answer this for me. Could we have an individual vote, each individual vote on a consensus for this resolution?
Vince, I can answer that, so you don't have to come up. We can.
Yeah, then I would like to request that.
And it's just consensus to draft the resolution, to begin
Yes.
drafting the resolution, not a final action.
Right.
Just one point in the resolution, we can bake into it how we want the revenue recoupment money to be spent. So that's just something to keep in mind. If we draft a very simple resolution, any amendments committee members would like to put forward would be entertained at that time. So it's not an end all be all.
Mr. Chairman, this is John Martin. May I speak?
Yes, Mr. Martin, go ahead.
I find myself growing uncomfortable with what appears to be a trend of resolutions coming before us, and then rather than voting no, we seek to amend them every time. Why not just vote? If this is the resolution that's up, we're supposed to vote on this stuff, and this anguish of amending every time and then wondering if the amendment's going to work and everything just seems to me to add a level of complexity to it. The majority rules, we should have a vote and remember that that's what we're doing. But this amending, this constant thought that we're going to amend, I don't know, it just seems to me to add a complexity to it that doesn't get us any place. I technically, as I understand it, the only way we can put this money in a bank account and hold it is to call it income. We have income loss. We have a series of moving targets. Nothing has any definition. And we need to just plop this money in the piggy bank until we can decide what to do. And that's all we're doing. So I would continue to support the thought that we put this money in a holding pattern. And I think that the way that we have to do it is as I understand it, is we have to call this income recoupment. So.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. And just to clarify, when I mentioned the concept of an amendment to the resolution, I think the majority of this committee would like to see a very simplified resolution drafted along the lines of what Mr. Leonard outlined. And I mentioned amendments because I know there is some disagreement on the point, and it's within the powers of committee members, if they want to change the resolution as it is, to propose an amendment and allow the committee to either vote yes or no on it. So I only reminded the committee that that is an option if they don't agree with the amendment as it will be drafted.
Mr. Chair, Bates, please.
Bates, and then we got to get wrapped up.
I think you are assuming that this committee is in favor of Mr. Leonard's proposal over Mr. Brown's proposal, and I don't see that. I would just assume put Mr. Brown's proposal forward as our resolution and see what happens.
Well,
I think you're assuming, making an assumption.
Well, because I had brought it up earlier, Mavis, and there was only a few no's, but let's just do it. We'll do a roll call, simple. Jenny, if you could. The question is, do we want to have a resolution drafted that's that kind of simplified, full flexibility outline that Mr. Leonard discussed? Yes or no? I think that's the question. So that being the question, Jenny, could you please call the roll?
I'm sorry. Please repeat again what we're voting on.
Mr. Leonard's suggestion of a simplified resolution that allows for that flexibility. We just say, yeah, we're going to take the revenue recoupment money and we'll come back to how we're going to use it later on.
Fry speaking.
Mr. Frost?
I guess I would just like to hear it, maybe ask Mr. Brown to define his position. I know we talked about it a little bit, but my feeling is to agree with Bill Leonard, but at the same time, I do like the comments Mr. Brown made, other than the fact that I don't know that we should be talking about specific dollar amounts, or I don't think we're ready to talk about specific dollar amounts. But just to clarify before the vote.
Brown speaking, and thank you for that, because as I mentioned just a little bit ago, I would agree with Mr. Leonard in his recommendation now because of those comments about not having specific dollar amounts.
Okay, thank you.
Any other quick comments or questions before we vote? All right, clerk, please call the roll.
Bates,
No.
Brown,
Yes.
Bras,
Yes.
Gums, absent. Kenyon,
Yes.
Leonard,
Yes.
Martin,
Martin, yes.
Molina,
Molina, yes.
Strathman,
Strathman, no.
Tepe,
No.
and Sanchez.
Sanchez, yes. Okay, so we have the consensus to draft the simplified budget resolution. So we'll get working on that with the state's attorney's office. And again, if there's any disagreements at the next meeting when it's voted upon, then it can be discussed at that time and amendments proposed and whatnot. So that being said, we also have a consensus to allow Ernst & Young to look at our department requests, simply to just separate into piles of FEMA eligibility, ARPA eligibility, and then also to create an RFP for the FEMA services. Does this committee want that RFP to come back to it first? Or should we just put it together, send it out there? Do you guys want to see it first?
No.
Anybody think they need to see it first? Looking at Shep. Okay, so we'll get the RFP put together and get that sent out. We'll keep you informed on that
Well,
process and when it happens.
Will this, excuse me, Jared.
Yeah, go ahead,
May I
Mark.
ask a question?
Yeah.
Will this, I commented in passing before that I would like the RFP to be broad enough that it enables us to utilize our consultant and not be caught in a trick bag of saying, well, they found money from another source, but they can't deal with it because we didn't have it in our job description. I mean,
Oh yeah,
I'm sure
point
that
well taken, Mr. Martin. And I categorize this in the lessons learned pile. When we put the RFP together, many eyes saw it, including members of this committee, state's attorney, myself. I mean, none of us thought to put that specific kind of language in there. Lessons learned. So it will definitely be broad enough, I think, perhaps even to encompass other federal programs that we might be able to get after. So, all right, we've got our tasks, consensus from the committee. I need a motion. Oh, wait, hold on. No new business, no old business, no executive session. Need a motion to adjourn.
Move to
Mr.
adjourn.
Kenyon.
Kenyon
Eight seconds.
moves, 8 seconds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you for